Okay, today I'm just dropping a quick update on the state of the project. I've already done all the brainstorming. I'm in a new stage now, so I'll talk a little bit about how I've gone through this phase transition from highly explorative to a lot more detailed thinking. And I'll also tell you a little bit about how the last experiment went and why I'm moving on to a slightly different idea. So I built the VM that I proposed in the last brainstorming session, and I worked with it for a little while, and it was just feeling like everything was just too clunky, too brittle. It was not very useful to work on that level of abstraction. As I talked about this idea with some other folks, one person pointed out that I was creating an interface where I was having to do all this low-level arrangement of details, and that what I probably needed was to think more carefully about the higher level structures that were most common so that I could iterate on those quickly. And that was partially correct. I think that was partially the right idea. So I spent some time thinking about what I could do to manage state without having to think about it from the level of bytecode or from the level of like a theoretical scripting language, but instead by having it directly tied in with the graph structure at the high level. And after iterating on that a few times, I did start to feel that it was clearing up. Similarly, I worked on higher level ideas for instead of having the graph stack be something that I control from a bytecode level, having the graphs I author directly include the idea of sort of going into a subgraph. So instead of encoding a push and a pop, you just have initial states and terminal states, and then when you go into a subgraph, that's a special kind of state in the graph or node in the graph that you can go into and out of, and the edges that flow into it and out of it sort of control where you go in and how you come out and where you go next after you leave it and stuff. So those changes by encoding the ideas into the higher level data structure of the editable interface did seem to show a lot of promise. And as I worked with them and tried to think about how I would make an interpreter that would take that and run it, there's a couple of ways I could do that, right? I could take the high-level graph interface that was proposed and translate it down to something smaller, like at a lower level, and run that. Or I could run an interpreter that runs right on top of the high-level thing. So I took a crack over the last... So it took me about a week to finish the VM stuff and to get feedback on it, and then another week, maybe less, to explore that high-level data structure idea a little more carefully. And after exploring the high-level data structure a little more carefully and trying for a day or two to put an interpreter on it, I came to the conclusion that was the leap from the high-level thing to an actual executable set of rules for executing it was just too big. At least right now, I can't grapple with it. So I started simplifying the graph structure, and I took it in little steps at a time. So I was never really changing fundamentally what its properties are in terms of what it can do and what it can express, but making it so that you had to use smaller atoms of the graph interface. And as I was going, I ended up boiling it down to something like a VM again, except now the new VM idea, which I'm going to put on the screen here, has the improved property over the first VM idea, which is that all of the different constituent parts of the VM kind of live at the same level of structuring or abstraction. So before I had a graph, and each vertex and each edge of the graph were containing bytecode. And then I was proposing to have a machine that would look at one of the nodes of the graph, run its bytecode, travel along an edge, run its bytecode, and so on. And that was getting clunky because it was running into issues of wait, do I have the ability from bytecode to do things like stop running this chunk of bytecode and travel down an edge right away? What do I have the ability to say I want to do that if we're in deterministic mode, but if we're doing look ahead, look across all the branches? When does look ahead start applying? All of these things were super confusing, and not the relationship between the high level graph structure that was containing the bytecode and the bytecode was really finicky. In the new one, everything is on a graph. There is no independent bytecode. If you have two instructions that you want to run back to back, you put each one in a node and put a series of edges together that chain them together. So there's not a block of bytecode. There's also no more bytecode on the paths at all. At the lowest level, the idea is that the nodes themselves will contain the instructions, and the edges between them will contain the control flow between them. And this kind of just turns into a regular VM, except that along the way, I boiled down this extra concept into it that I'm calling a fork, which is sort of a moment of non-determinism that gets handled by doing the look-ahead stuff. And so I'm not going to go through the whole plan here because, again, it's still in design, but this is a much more unified picture of sort of which I think puts together both things that I want. It's a little bit clearer to me how I translate from a high level graph to this, if that's what I want to do. And it's pretty clear to me how I execute this. And it's pretty clear to me that this can be used to encode the kinds of behavioral structures that I'm looking for. So I think with this iteration, I have a chance at finally answering the question of if I like how this feels when this particular set of behaviors is put together in the VM, and a way to a path to put a possible high level graph authoring structure on top of it that I can translate down to. And all the steps seem to me doable. The only question is, once they're all done, if I like how it feels. But for once, there's no open question of like, is it like, how will the design look? I think that I see the design finally. And so that has all happened because I started doing a much more careful, detailed oriented pattern of thinking instead of this feeling out, talking out the ideas here, which was very useful for a time. I moved into like, okay, step by step, methodically going through the iterations of like, what would this look like if it was just a strict machine, and then what if I add in a little branching? What are the pros and cons of the forks working in several different ways? How do I imagine that this relates to the higher level thing? And after going through all the details carefully, I see the picture now, and the next step is to implement that. The reason I'm doing this recap here is partly so that if you've been following along, you know where I'm at, what I'm doing next, but also because while doing the thinking out loud was not the right move in this case, stating the plan out loud still seems to transform the problem in my head a little bit. It feels useful to get it out loud instead of just having it stuck in my head. So that's what I'm doing here. You know what I'm doing now. I know what I'm doing now. It's probably going to be another week or two of just the grinding through the implementation details on this one, and then we'll see where we pop out in terms of how successful this structure is and design questions that come up next, and so on and so on. So that is where the project is at. Keep an eye out because there might be more in a couple weeks, but until then, I will go back to being quiet and turning on these ideas. Later.